My name is Emre. I am from Istanbul. And I want to start by saying something that I think will immediately make my story feel different from other stories you may have heard on a channel like this. Nobody threatened to kill me. Nobody put me in prison. Nobody confiscated my passport. Nobody raided my apartment. The country I come from, Turkey, is a secular republic with a constitutionally guaranteed right to freedom of religion. Conversion from Islam to Christianity is not a criminal offense in Turkey. Legally, I was free to believe whatever I wanted. And yet the cost of what I did was, in its own way, the most painful thing I have experienced in my life. Not because the pain was physical, but because the people who were most devastated by my conversion were not fundamentalists, they were not extremists. They were educated, sophisticated, liberal, cosmopolitan people who prided themselves on having moved beyond religious tribalism. My father was a university professor who had spent his career arguing for Enlightenment values, for rational inquiry, for freedom of conscience. And the freedom of conscience he had championed all his professional life turned out to have a specific limit. The limit was not this, not his son, not Christianity. This is a story about the kind of cost that does not show up on news reports about religious persecution. It is a story about the slow, quiet, devastating loss of the regard of people whose regard you have built your entire sense of self upon. And it is a story about what happened 3 years later in a hospital room in Istanbul that I did not see coming and that I am still honestly processing. Let me start from the beginning. Istanbul is not one city. It is many cities existing simultaneously in the same geography. Ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, deeply religious in some neighborhoods and aggressively secular in others, beautiful and chaotic and unlike anywhere else on earth. I grew up in the secular, educated, westernized Istanbul, the Istanbul of Bosphorus apartments and university corridors and dinner table arguments about Ataturk and the EU and the direction of the country. My Istanbul was Kadıköy on the Asian side, cafes and bookshops and the specific smell of a city that has been continuously inhabited for 3,000 years. My father, Professor Murat Yilmaz, taught political science at one of Istanbul's major universities for 30 years. He was and remains in the way that certain intellectuals remain what they are regardless of what happens around them. A man of the Enlightenment. Kemal Atatürk was his hero not just politically but philosophically. The idea of Turkey as a modern, rational, secular nation that had successfully separated religion from public life and emerged as a functional democracy. My father had dedicated his professional life to this vision, had written books about it, had taught it to generations of students. He was proud, rigorous, somewhat cold in the specific way that academics who have spent their lives in institutions can be cold, and he loved his children with a love that was expressed more through expectation than through warmth. My mother was warmer. She was an architect. A woman of aesthetic sensibility and practical intelligence who balanced my father's austerity with a kind of humane creativity. She made the apartment beautiful. She made it feel like a home. She was the one who asked about feelings rather than grades, who noticed when something was wrong before you had said anything. I loved both my parents in completely different ways and for completely different reasons. Islam in our house was cultural furniture. We celebrated Eid because it was family tradition and because my grandmother on my mother's side expected it. My father occasionally went to mosque, at funerals, at certain significant moments, at Eid itself, not from belief but from social form. He considered himself an agnostic in the specific way that secular Turkish intellectuals of his generation considered themselves agnostic, not actively hostile to the idea of God, simply having moved past the question as a matter of personal and intellectual progression. Religion was what uneducated people needed, and educated people had outgrown. This was not said cruelly. It was said the way that people say things that they consider obvious and therefore not requiring of cruelty. I absorbed this framework completely. By the time I was in university studying computer science, I was a committed atheist, not agnostic like my father, but actively convinced that the God question had been answered and the answer was no. I read The New Atheists. I found the arguments compelling. I had long, enjoyable dinner table debates with anyone who was willing, in which I deployed Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris with the confidence of a young man who believes he has arrived at the correct conclusions. I was 23 years old and I was certain, and I was completely unaware of how much I did not know about my own interior. I graduated and became a software engineer. I was good at it. The kind of thinking required, the systematic problem solving, the satisfaction of making something complex work correctly. It suited how my mind operated. I joined a tech company in Istanbul, progressed quickly, became a senior engineer, eventually a team lead. I built a life that looked by every measure my world offered like success. I was also, underneath all of that, increasingly unhappy. Not dramatically unhappy, not depressed in a clinical sense, not unable to function, just hollow in a way that I kept ignoring because I had no framework for addressing it. I had everything that my framework said should produce satisfaction: good work, professional respect, a city I loved, friends I enjoyed, the intellectual stimulation of the debates and conversations that were the social currency of my world. And yet there was something that none of it reached. A question that kept surfacing in the middle of the night or at the end of a long weekend when the noise of the week died down and there was nothing between me and the quiet. The question was not theological exactly. It was more fundamental than theology. It was something like, what is this for? Not in the nihilistic sense, not the despair of a person who has concluded that nothing matters. More like the genuine curiosity of a person who suspects that something matters enormously but cannot identify what it is. The question of meaning. The question of whether the story of my life was building towards something or simply accumulating. I was 30 at this point. I had been having this question in various forms for several years without doing much with it. And then I had a conversation that cracked something open. I was at a dinner party at a colleague's apartment. A tech industry gathering, the kind of event where the conversation moves between product releases and politics and the particular variety of cynicism that educated urban professionals in Turkey had developed in response to watching the country's political landscape shift in ways that felt threatening to everything my world represented. Sitting next to me was a man I had not met before. He had come with someone else. I was never entirely clear whose friend he was. His name was Kerem. He was a few years older than me, software architect, quietly confident in the way of a person who is not performing confidence because they don't need to. We ended up talking for most of the evening. Kerem was a Christian. He told me this casually, without apology, somewhere in the middle of a conversation that had moved from technology to philosophy to the question of meaning. I was briefly surprised. Christians in my social world in Istanbul were rare and generally quiet about it. I asked him, with the directness that my world normalized, how an intelligent person in the 21st century could believe what Christianity requires believing. He did not get defensive. He did not reach for easy answers. He said, "That's a good question. What specifically do you think it requires believing?" And we spent the next 2 hours in a conversation that was, unlike most of my conversations about religion, which I had always won easily and which had therefore not taught me anything, genuinely challenging. Not because Kerem was a better debater than me, but because the specific arguments I had been relying on were not landing the way they usually did. He had heard them. He had considered them. He had answers that were not dismissible. And he had something else that I noticed but could not immediately account for. He was asking better questions than I was. That dinner party conversation was the beginning. I want to be honest about how long the road from that dinner party to genuine faith was, because I think there is sometimes an impression that conversion is a rapid event, a moment of sudden light, a single prayer, an immediate transformation. For some people it is. For me, it was approximately 3 years of the most sustained intellectual and personal wrestling of my life. Kerem and I kept talking. We met for coffee regularly, which in Istanbul means proper Turkish coffee in small cups with enough caffeine to power a small city, and conversations that go longer than planned. He gave me books, not just apologetics books, though some of those, but also history, philosophy, theology, the kind of reading that took the questions seriously, rather than assuming they had simple answers. He recommended C.S. Lewis and N.T. Wright and Tim Keller and Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov and the Gospel of John and the Letters of Paul. I read all of it with the same rigor I had always applied to intellectual pursuits. I was not going to believe anything I could not think through. The intellectual questions were real, and I'm not going to summarize them quickly because doing so would be dishonest. I wrestled genuinely with the problem of evil, how a good God and a world that contains Auschwitz can both be real simultaneously. I wrestled with the resurrection. The historical question of whether the accounts were credible, whether there was a better explanation for the early church's extraordinary conviction that Jesus had physically risen from the dead. I wrestled with the problem of religious pluralism. If Christianity is true, what about the billions of people who have lived and died in other traditions? I took these questions to Kerem, and he took them seriously, and we argued, and I pushed back and he pushed back, and the conversation never stopped. But here is what I discovered. Somewhere in the second year of this process, the intellectual questions, while real and important, were not actually the thing that was keeping me from faith. They were the front I was presenting. Underneath the intellectual objections was something more personal, more vulnerable, more difficult to examine. Underneath the intellectual objections was a man who had built his entire identity on being the kind of person who did not need God, who was beyond that, who had graduated, as his father had graduated, from the primitive comforts of religion into the clean air of rational self-sufficiency. To become a Christian was not merely to change my theological conclusions. It was to become, in the most fundamental sense, the kind of person my father had spent his life not being, the kind of person my world considered intellectually weak. Kerem, at some point in the second year, said something to me that I have never forgotten. He said, Emre, I've noticed that when the intellectual arguments run out, you find new ones. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I think the intellectual work matters and I've enjoyed doing it with you. But I want to ask you something different. Setting the arguments aside for a moment, what would it cost you to believe? Not what would be wrong about it intellectually. What would it cost you personally? I sat with that question for a long time, longer than I admitted to him at the time, because the answer was things I was not ready to say out loud. It would cost me my identity as my father's son. It would cost me the approval of the world I had built myself in. It would cost me the specific kind of self-sufficiency that I had used for 30 years as a substitute for the thing I was actually looking for. I was not ready to pay that cost for another year. And then, one night in February, in my apartment in Kadıköy, I had been reading the 14th chapter of John, the passage where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And something about those words, not the first claim, not the grand metaphysical assertion, but the second part, do not let your hearts be troubled. Something about those words reached past all of my arguments and all of my defenses and touched the thing that had been hollow for so long. The thing that the work and the coffee conversations and the intellectual stimulation had not been able to reach. I put the book down. I looked at the Bosphorus from my apartment window. It was late and the water was dark and the lights of the European side were reflected in it in that specific way that Istanbul has of being beautiful at the exact moments when you are least expecting it. And I said out loud to no one visible, if you are there, I think you are there. I am not sure how to do this, but I want what you are offering. I want the thing I've been looking for without knowing what it was. I am yours. That was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just a man in an apartment in Istanbul, finally admitting out loud what he had been slowly approaching for 3 years. I called Kerem the next morning. He cried. I found that embarrassing and also unexpectedly moving. I did not immediately tell my parents. I spent several months being baptized, finding a church community, learning what it meant to actually live as a Christian rather than intellectually assent to it. Kerem's church was a small congregation that met in a rented space near Taksim. International in flavor, a mixture of Turkish converts and foreign Christians living in Istanbul, warm and serious and not remotely interested in easy answers. I found in that community the first experience of being known without performing that I had ever had in my adult life. People who knew my doubts and did not require me to pretend I did not have them. People who prayed for each other with specific personal attention that was completely unlike anything I had experienced in any other social context. I told my parents on a Sunday afternoon in their apartment. I had been there for lunch, the weekly family lunch that my mother maintained as an institution regardless of what else was happening, which I loved because it was one of the few contexts in which my family simply existed together without agenda. After lunch, while my mother was making tea and my father was in his chair with a newspaper, I told them, I want to try to describe my father's response because it is the center of what happened next and because it was, this is the honest word, more devastating than I had prepared for. My father put down his newspaper. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. And then he said, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, you have become a Christian. I said yes. He said, let me understand this correctly. You, who I raised to think for yourself, who I educated at every level in the values of rationalism and evidence and intellectual freedom, you have decided to join a religion. I said, yes. He said, which religion? The religion of the Crusades, the religion of the Inquisition, the religion that colonized half the world in the name of civilizing it. You have decided that this is the intellectual framework that best accounts for reality. He was not shouting. My father never shouted. He was doing something more precise and more painful than shouting. He was dissecting. He was applying to me the same surgical intellectual instrument he applied to arguments he found defective in his seminars. I was a bad argument. I was a position to be taken apart. I tried to respond. I had prepared for this. I had 3 years of intellectual work to draw on, and I presented some of it. My father listened. He was always a fair listener in debates. And then he said, at the end of my response, the question is not whether you can construct a sophisticated defense of your position. The question is whether you have abandoned your capacity for independent thought in favor of the comfort of a belief system. And I think you have. My mother was crying quietly in the kitchen. I could hear her. My father picked up his newspaper again. I understood that the conversation was over. I drove home to Kadıköy and I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. Not on the floor this time. In the car, gripping the steering wheel with the specific pain of a man who has just been told by the person whose opinion has always mattered most to him that he has failed. Not at a task, as a person, as a thinker, as a son. What followed over the next 3 years was a form of loss that I want to describe carefully, because I think it is important, and because it is the form of loss that people in secular contexts often face, and that does not get enough attention in conversations about religious conversion. My father and I essentially stopped having a real relationship. We still appeared together at family occasions. My mother insisted on this, and I honored her insistence because she was the one maintaining the family in the face of my father's withdrawal. We exchanged the minimum necessary pleasantries, but the thing that had always been between us, the intellectual engagement, the debates, the specific pleasure of disagreeing with each other at dinner while fundamentally respecting each other, that was gone. My father had concluded that I was no longer worth debating because I had abandoned the rational framework within which debate was possible. I had stepped outside the conversation. He had nothing to say to me. Professionally, the cost was also real. Istanbul's tech industry, at least the layer of it I inhabited, was largely populated by people from similar backgrounds to mine. Secular, educated, urban, skeptical. When my faith became known, and it became known because in a social world that small, things become known, the response was varied, but predominantly some version of what my father had expressed, surprise shading into mild contempt. The specific kind of social cooling that happens when someone you considered an intellectual equal reveals what you consider a surprising intellectual weakness. I did not lose my job, but I lost the professional regard of people whose regard I had valued. I lost the easy belonging of a tribe I had been part of my entire adult life. I want to be precise about something here, because I think it is an important distinction. The people who responded to my conversion with contempt were not bad people. They were not being gratuitously cruel. They were operating from within a framework that was completely coherent on its own terms. A framework that said, educated people do not believe in gods, and people who believe in gods despite being educated have made an intellectual error, and intellectual errors of that magnitude are worth noting. Within that framework, their response was logical. I understood it. I had once shared that framework. I knew exactly how they were thinking about me, because I had once thought about religious people in exactly the same way. That understanding made it lonelier, not less lonely, because I could not even tell myself they were wrong to respond as they did. Not entirely. I could see myself from inside their perspective. And from inside their perspective, I looked like someone who had disappointed them. I want to tell you about one friendship in particular. A man I had been close to since university. I will call him Alp. We had been genuine friends for 12 years. The kind of friend you call at 2 in the morning. The kind of friend who knows all the versions of you. When I told Alp about my faith, his response was different from my father's. Not surgical contempt, but something warmer, and in its own way harder to navigate. He said, Emre, I love you. I'm not going to pretend I understand this. I think you have made a mistake. But you are my friend and I will stay your friend. And for a while he did. For about a year he tried. But something had changed between us. The intellectual equality that had been the foundation of our friendship, the sense that we saw the world in compatible ways, was gone. He could not quite look at me the same way. He tried to hide it. He did not succeed. And eventually the friendship that had survived 12 years of everything that friendship survived did not survive this. Not with an argument, not with a falling out, just with a slow withdrawal that I recognized and that he, I think, recognized too. We still acknowledge each other, but the friendship is gone. This is the cost that is invisible to people outside secular urban context. Not a raid, not a prison sentence, not a threat to physical safety. Just the slow daily grinding loss of the regard of the people who had always reflected back to you the version of yourself you wanted to be. And yet, and this is the thing I need to say clearly, I did not regret it. Through 3 years of my father's silence and Alp's withdrawal and the professional cooling and the general sense of having stepped outside my tribe, through all of it, I did not once seriously consider going back. Not because the cost was trivial, because what I had found was more real than anything the cost was taking. Because the thing that had been hollow for so long was no longer hollow. Because I had found in that small church near Taksim and in Kerem's friendship and in the slowly deepening reality of prayer, the thing I had been looking for since I was old enough to notice I was looking. I had found the ground, and the ground held even when everything on top of it was shifting. I want to stop here, because I know that the story I'm telling, a story about the cost of faith in a secular context, about the specific loneliness of being the educated person in the room who believes, I know this story is more common than it is spoken about. Most conversion testimonies focus on dramatic external persecution, and that persecution is real and it is serious and I do not minimize it. But there is another kind of persecution that happens in offices and dinner parties and family apartments in Istanbul and Paris and New York and London, where no one threatens you with prison but the contempt of intelligent people is deployed with a precision that goes very deep. If that is your story, if you are carrying faith in a context where faith is considered weakness, I see you. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are. We are not as alone as our contexts make us feel. Keep watching. I want to tell you what changed, not dramatically, not in the ways that make for compelling news stories, but in the ways that matter. The hollowness went away. This sounds simple. It is the most significant thing that has happened to me in my adult life. The specific absence that had been present through all the years of success and intellectual certainty and professional achievement. That absence filled. Not all at once, not completely, not permanently without ever returning, but substantially, persistently in a way that I can only describe as, there is now a ground. There is something underneath the day-to-day of life that is there when I reach for it. That was not there before. I tried many things to put it there before. Work, relationships, intellectual stimulation, the particular pleasures of Istanbul on a spring evening. None of them put it there. This did. My relationship with other people changed, not in dramatic ways. I did not become a different personality. I was still precise, still analytical, still capable of the same intellectual arguments, but I became more interested in people as people. Less interested in winning conversations, more interested in understanding the person I was in conversation with. Less defended somehow. Less armored. Prayer, which I had expected to find awkward and which I found awkward at first, gradually became the thing that most consistently opened me. The practice of bringing things to God rather than managing them myself produced over time a quality of openness that I had not had before and that changed how I was with other people. I became, my mother told me once with genuine surprise in her voice, kinder, not softer. I do not think I became less honest or less direct, but kinder. More aware of what people were carrying, more willing to sit with difficulty rather than solve it. She said it with the specific wonder of someone describing something they did not expect. I think she meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. My work changed too, not the technical content of it, but my relationship to it. I had been someone who found meaning primarily through professional achievement. I still found meaning in the work. I was still good at it and still cared about doing it well, but it was no longer the primary thing. It no longer bore the full weight of my sense of self, which made it paradoxically better. Work done without the desperate need for it to be the meaning of your life is work done with more freedom and I think more creativity. I kept showing up. This is the thing that I think is most important about what faith gave me, and it is the least glamorous. I kept showing up to the church, to the conversations I had not wanted to have, to my mother's Sunday lunches even when my father's silence was a physical presence in the room, to the professional relationships that had cooled. I did not retreat. I was not performing courage. I was genuinely sustained by something that made showing up possible when my natural tendency would have been to withdraw. The God I had found was not a God who helped me escape from difficulty. He was a God who made difficulty navigable. That is different. That is better. I want to talk about my mother because she is the person who held the thread between my father and me through 3 years of distance, and because I think her role in my story is not small. My mother did not share my faith. She did not become a Christian. She has not become a Christian as far as I know, and I do not have any agenda regarding that. But my mother did something that my father could not bring himself to do, which was to separate her love for me from her agreement with my choices. She continued to call. She continued to include me in the Sunday lunches. She asked about my life with genuine curiosity, about my church, about Kerem, about what I was reading and thinking. She did not agree with any of it, but she asked, and she listened to the answers. Once, it was about a year and a half after my conversion, so deep into my father's silence, we had coffee together alone, just the two of us in a cafe near her office, and she said, "You seem different, Emre. I have been watching you for the past year and a half and you are different. I don't know what it is exactly. You are quieter, less, I don't know the right word, less armored maybe, less like you need to win." She paused. "I don't understand what you believe. I want you to know that. I haven't become convinced of anything. But I think whatever is happening to you is happening in a direction that is good, and I want you to know I see it." I held those words for a long time. My mother, who did not share my faith, who had grown up in the same secular framework as my father, who had every cultural and intellectual reason to respond the way my father responded. My mother had looked at the effect of what I had found and said, "I see it. I don't understand it, but I see it." That was its own kind of grace, not the grace of agreement. The grace of being seen by someone who loves you even when they cannot follow where you have gone. My mother became, over those 3 years, the bridge between my father and me. She relayed information. She maintained the minimum of contact that kept the door from closing entirely. She told my father occasionally what she had said to me in the cafe. She was not trying to convert him. She was trying to keep a family together with the only tool available, her own consistent, unconditional, slightly exhausted love for both of us. I am more grateful for that than I know how to say. 3 years after my conversion, Emre was 36. I had been navigating my father's silence for 3 years. My mother called me on a Thursday evening to tell me that my father had been admitted to hospital. A cardiac event. Not a heart attack, not immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to require hospitalization and monitoring, and the kind of medical consultation that makes a family understand that the person they had been assuming would always be there is in fact a person with a body that has limits. I went to the hospital immediately. My mother was in the corridor outside the room. She held me. She had been afraid. I could feel the fear in how she held me. And then she said, "He asked for you." He asked specifically. I want to describe walking into that room, because it was one of the most significant walks of my life. My father was in the hospital bed, smaller than he usually seemed, which is what illness does to people, makes them human in ways that health allows you to ignore. The professor, the intellectual authority, the man whose regard I had spent 40 years trying to deserve. He was in a hospital gown with a monitor attached to him and his glasses on the bedside table, and he looked, for the first time in my memory, uncertain. Not intellectually uncertain. That was not a state he permitted himself. Uncertain in the way of a person who has spent a great deal of time being very sure of things and has just encountered the limit of certainty. I sat in the chair beside the bed. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke for a moment. And then my father said, and I want to be accurate about this, I have gone over it many times in my memory. He said, "I have been lying here since yesterday thinking about you." I said, "Well, what have you been thinking?" He said, "I have been thinking about what I said to you 3 years ago, that you had abandoned independent thought. I've been thinking about whether that was true." I waited. He said, "I have spent my career arguing that the capacity to follow evidence where it leads is the highest intellectual virtue. Evidence, reason, honest inquiry." He stopped. "When the evidence you were following led somewhere I had not expected, I told you that you had stopped thinking. I did not engage with your arguments. I dismissed them, because the conclusion made me uncomfortable." Another pause. "That is not what I taught. That is not what I believe good thinking looks like. I want to say that I am sorry." I did not respond immediately. I could not. My father, the man who had never apologized to me in 40 years that I could remember, who had never been wrong in any conversation we had ever had, who had applied to me the same precision he applied to arguments he found defective. My father was saying he was sorry. I said, "I don't need you to believe what I believe. I have never needed that." He said, I know that now. I think I have known it for a while. I was too proud to say it." We sat together for 2 hours that evening. We did not resolve the theology. My father did not become a Christian in that hospital room, and I did not expect him to, and that was not what was happening. What was happening was different and more important. What was happening was a man and his son finding their way back to each other across a distance that had been built not by genuine incompatibility, but by pride. His pride, and honestly mine. He asked me questions that evening. Real questions, the questions of a man who is genuinely curious rather than preparing to argue. He asked what I had found that he had not been able to give me. He asked what prayer was like. He asked whether I still read philosophy, and what I thought the relationship between faith and reason was. I answered him as carefully and as honestly as I could. And at the end of the evening, when visiting hours were ending and I had to leave, he took my hand. My father, who was not a person who took hands, took mine. He said, "Come back tomorrow." I said yes. I walked out of that hospital into a Thursday evening in Istanbul. The Bosphorus visible at the end of the street, the lights of the city reflected in it, the specific beauty of a place I had loved my whole life. And I stood on the pavement and I let it arrive. The full weight of what had just happened. And I said, to the God who had been patient with my father for the same 3 years he had been patient with me, thank you. Just thank you. I need to pause here because what I just described, my father in that hospital room, I have not told that story publicly before. And I want to say something directly to anyone watching who has a relationship with someone they love that has been broken by faith. Not by disagreement about faith, by pride. By the gap between where someone is and where you expected them to be. If that describes a relationship in your life, with a parent, a child, a friend, I want to tell you, the gap is not the end. I did not fix the gap. I did not argue my way across it. I kept showing up. I kept praying for my father by name. I kept going to my mother's Sunday lunches even when he would not look at me. I let 3 years pass. And then, in a hospital room on a Thursday evening, something moved that I could not have moved. Keep praying. Keep showing up. Let God do what only God can do. And now let me finish. My father came home from the hospital after 5 days. The cardiac situation was managed. Medication, lifestyle changes, the specific humbling of a proud man by his own body's refusal to remain indefinitely young. He is fine now, or as fine as a 70-year-old man with a cardiac history can be fine. The relationship between us since that evening has been, I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I do not want to over-romanticize it. It is not a fairy tale. My father did not become warm where he had been cold. He did not transform into a different person. He is still the man he has always been. Precise, somewhat formal, not given to the expression of emotion. The differences are quieter than that. He asks about my church now. Not in the way of a man who is interested in joining. He is not, and I do not expect that. But in the way of a man who has decided that what his son does matters to him even when he does not understand it. He asks who I know there, what we talk about, what the community is like. He is engaging with it the way he engages with things he finds intellectually interesting, with careful attention and a willingness to withhold final judgment until he has more information. He came to my church once, not on a Sunday, not to a service, not yet, but to a community gathering that was open to the public, where a visiting scholar was speaking about the intersection of Christian theology and political philosophy. My father did not come as a believer. He came as a political philosophy professor who was curious about the argument. He disagreed with several points. He told me this at length afterward. I listened and did not try to win the disagreement. We argued about it across a dinner table at my mother's apartment, and it felt, for the first time in 4 years, like talking to my father. He has not apologized again. The one apology was not a personality transplant. He is still proud, but the wall he built is down, and we are both, imperfectly and with continued effort, trying to find out what our relationship looks like now that the wall is not there. I think it looks like two people who love each other and disagree about things that matter and have decided that the love is more important than the agreement, which is, I think, what love usually has to look like in real life, between real people, in real families. It is not the easy version, but it is the real version. And the real version is worth more than the easy version. I want to say something about Turkey, because I think the specific context of my conversion, a secular Muslim majority country with a complicated relationship between Islam and nationalism and modernity, taught me things about faith that I would not have learned anywhere else. Turkey is a country in the middle of a deep argument with itself about what it is and what it wants to be. The tension between the secular Kemalist vision that my father represented and the religious nationalist current that has been growing in Turkish political life for the past 2 decades is a tension that runs through every institution, every family dinner, every conversation about the country's direction. I grew up on one side of that tension. I now inhabit an unusual position, a convert from the secular tradition who found his way to faith, who is therefore neither a secular Kemalist nor a religious nationalist, who is something that Turkey's existing categories do not quite have a slot for. What this has taught me about faith is something about the difference between religion as identity and faith as relationship. In Turkey, and I think this is true in many places, Islam functions primarily as an identity marker. To be Turk, to be Arab, to be Malay, to be Iranian. In all these contexts, to be those things has historically involved being Muslim, not necessarily because of genuine personal belief, but because of the cultural and social function that religious identity performs. Religion as the flag of a community, as the language of belonging, as the mark of being one of us rather than one of them. What I found in my conversion was something entirely different from that. What I found was not an identity. What I found was a person. A specific, historically grounded, theologically complex, personally accessible person who said, "Come to me." Not join our team, not adopt our cultural markers, not perform our rituals. Come to me, personally, specifically. Bring the actual content of your actual life. The God I found in the 14th chapter of John, and in the years of conversation with Kerem, and in the small church near Taksim, and in the prayer practice that has slowly become the most important discipline of my life, that God was not asking me to trade one identity for another. He was not asking me to stop being Turkish, or stop being the son of Murat Yilmaz, or stop thinking carefully about things. He was asking me to bring all of that, the specific, irreplaceable, complicated contents of being me, and to trust that it was held, that I was known, that the ground underneath all of it was solid in a way that nothing else I had tried had been solid. This distinction between religion as identity and faith as relationship, I think, is one of the most important things I can offer anyone watching this who is where I was. If Christianity sounds to you like a different tribe to join, a different cultural allegiance to perform, a different set of identity markers to adopt, I understand that. That is how it often looks from outside. But that is not what it is. Or at least that is not what it is at its core, at its origin in the actual texts. At its core, what it is, come to me. All of you who are weary, I will give you rest. Come and see. I told you about Alp, the friend of 12 years whose friendship did not survive my conversion. I want to come back to him briefly because his story is not finished either. About 2 years after the friendship effectively ended, so a year after the hospital, I ran into Alp at a tech conference in Istanbul. We had not spoken meaningfully in nearly 2 years. The awkward acknowledgement at mutual events had been enough to confirm that the friendship was over. And then we were standing next to each other at a coffee station between conference sessions, and neither of us had anywhere to go immediately. He asked how I was. I told him I was well, genuinely, not performatively. He looked at me for a moment with the specific look of someone doing an assessment they had not planned to do. And then he said, "You look good, Emre. I mean that seriously. You look settled. It suits you." I said, "It's been a good period." He said after a pause, "I want to say something. I think I was unfair to you. Not about the faith thing, I still don't understand it and I'm not going to pretend I do, but I think I was unfair in how I handled it. I think I let something that should have been your business become a reason to treat you like you had changed in a way that required distance. That was not right of me. This was not a full reconciliation. We did not pick up the friendship where it left off. We are not close in the way we were, but we speak now. He came to a thing I organized and we talked properly for the first time in 2 years. The contempt is gone. Maybe the friendship will rebuild into something. Maybe it won't. But the door is open. And the door being open is not nothing. The door being open is in fact the thing I have learned to be most grateful for in this season of my life. Doors that open. After the long years of doors that were closed, I want to speak directly to the person who is where I was, who identifies as atheist or agnostic or not religious, who was raised in a secular framework, who has used intellectual arguments as a primary tool for engaging with the God question, and who finds the arguments for Christianity at best interesting and at worst below the level of serious consideration. I was you. I know the arguments. I made the arguments. I was better at them than most people I debated, which is part of what took so long. I could always find a new intellectual objection when the previous one was addressed. What I want to say to you is not that the arguments are wrong. Some of them are wrong. Some of them are not. The intellectual work is real, and I think it matters, and I do not think you should abandon it. Faith that has not been tested by honest questioning is not the kind of faith worth having. What I want to say to you is the question that Kerem asked me, not what is wrong with Christianity intellectually, but what would it cost you to believe? What is the thing underneath the intellectual arguments that is actually keeping you where you are? What identity? What self-image? What relationship with your tribe? What version of yourself would you have to let go of? Because I found in the end that the intellectual arguments were the door, and the real issue was what was behind the door. The real issue was a man who had built his entire sense of himself on not needing what the gospel was offering, on being the kind of person who had outgrown that. And the real question was whether I was willing to let that identity go, not for something lesser, not for intellectual weakness, but for something that I had spent 30 years looking for and had finally found in the 14th chapter of John in an apartment in Karakoy on a February night. The ground is solid. The arguments have not destroyed it, and believe me, I tried. The ground is solid, and it is available to you. Not to the version of you that your world requires you to perform, to the actual you, the one who has the hollow question in the middle of the night, the one who has been looking for the ground and has not found it yet. Come and see. That is all. Come and see. My father is 70 years old. He reads more slowly now than he used to, which frustrates him enormously. He goes to the mosque for aid. The same mosque he always went to for aid, for the same reasons he always went. Cultural form, social obligation, the particular comfort of familiar rituals. He does not believe in God in any clear sense that I can identify. He is still fundamentally the man he has always been. But there is something new in him since the hospital. Something I notice in the way he asks me questions about my faith. He asks with a quality of attention that is different from argument preparation. He is not building a case. He is, and I want to be careful here. I do not want to project onto him something that is not there. He seems to be considering, not deciding, considering, holding the question in a way he did not hold it before. I have not pushed this. I do not intend to push it. My father spent 40 years teaching students that honest inquiry requires following evidence where it leads. I believe the Spirit of God can do for him what the Spirit did for me, through honest inquiry over time. I am not in a hurry. I pray for my father the same way I have prayed for him since the conversion, by name, with specificity, with patience. Murat, please, whatever he needs, in whatever time. The specific thing I pray for him is the thing I most needed and most received, the peace of the ground that holds when everything on top of it is shifting. I pray that he finds that. Not in the form of a dramatic conversion, not as the punchline to a story I'm trying to construct, just the ground, the thing underneath, the thing that was there before his certainty was built on top of it, and that will be there after every certainty has been questioned. The thing that says, do not let your heart be troubled. I am here. That is the prayer. I will keep praying it. I want to end with Istanbul, because Istanbul is where all of this happened, and because I love it, and because I think places deserve to be honored in the stories that happen in them. Istanbul is the city where the secular and the sacred have been arguing with each other for 100 years, and where neither has won, and where neither is likely to win, and where the argument itself has produced something that I can only call beautiful in its complexity. The Blue Mosque and the Ataturk Cultural Center on opposite sides of the same square. The call to prayer moving over a city where half the people in the cafes are not observing Ramadan. The Bosphorus running between two continents. The oldest bridge in the world, metaphorically, not literally, between East and West. I live in this city. I love this city. I go to a church in this city where Turkish converts and foreign Christians pray together in Turkish and English and sometimes Farsi, in a rented space that is not grand but is full of people who mean what they say when they say it. I work as a software engineer. I argue about technology and politics and philosophy. I have coffee with Kerem, who is still my closest friend. I call my mother on Sunday afternoons. I have dinner with my father once a month, and we debate things across the table, and it feels, I want to say this carefully and accurately, it feels like being with my father. My identity card says I was born to a Muslim family in Istanbul, Turkey. That is true. I was also at 33 years old in an apartment in Kadıköy, found by something I'd spent 10 years insisting was not there. Found. As in, the shepherd who leaves the 99 and goes looking for the one. As in, the father who runs. As in, the God who says to a Turkish software engineer who had thought he was too smart for this, do not let your heart be troubled. I am here. I am here. That is the testimony. That is what I have to give you. My name is Emre Yilmaz. I am 41 years old. I live in Istanbul. And the ground is solid. One last thing before I go. If this story found you, if any part of it recognized something in you that you have been carrying without knowing what to call it, I want to give you one practical thing to do. Not a church to join, not a prayer to pray, not an identity to adopt. One thing. Read the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John. It is short. It takes 5 minutes. Read it slowly. Read it as if it might be addressed to you personally, and then sit with what it produces in you. That is all. If this story helped you, share it with one person. One person. The one in your life who is where you used to be, or where I used to be, or where you still are in some part of yourself. Send it to them. You do not need to say anything about it. Just watch this. Subscribe to this channel. There are more voices coming. More people, more countries, more paths to the same ground. The ground is solid. Come and see. My name is Emre, and this is my testimony.